All right, hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about negligence, which is also something that you had just read about a few days ago, but I wanted to film this lecture video so that I can clarify some of the misconceptions that you may have had the first time that you read about it. Negligence, not the easiest thing to understand, so hopefully I can shed some light on some misunderstandings that you may have. All right, so let's start out. Up until this point, you had learned about intentional torts already. Intentional torts being battery, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation. These are all things that one individual or company does to another individual or company intentionally. That the action was not done by accident. Negligence, on the other hand, makes up the vast majority of tort actions because negligence is not intentional. Oftentimes, most reasonable people don't intentionally harm another person. Rather, if they harm another person, they usually do it as a result of an accident that had occurred. So negligence is this idea that all people in society have a general duty or this legal obligation to exercise reasonable care towards other persons and property. Negligence law is concerned with actions or sometimes inactions, something that you didn't do, that violates this standard of reasonable care. So I know that we haven't been meeting in person, but this is something that I would really hammer home if we were in class, is this idea of what is reasonable behavior. So for example, that assignment that you had completed, whose fault is it anyways scenarios. In those scenarios, I was always asking about who the plaintiff was. So who was the one actually bringing the lawsuit, who's bringing the complaint, who the defendant was, so who was being sued. And then furthermore, I was always asking, was the behavior of the defendant reasonable? Were they acting in a way that showed that they were using a proper amount of care? Or was their behavior considered unreasonable? And then you just kind of had to make your argument as to whether or not that defendant had acted with a reasonable amount of care. So, negligence law is concerned with when people don't use that reasonable amount of care. So, for some examples, the surgeon forgets to remove a clamp from a patient's body after operating and stitching up a patient. Another one, a city employee forgets to cover a manhole being those holes in the ground in the middle of the street. If a city employee forgets to cover one of those and a pedestrian walking by falls in, that's a situation which that city employee was not acting with a reasonable amount of care. A reasonable person would have covered up that manhole if they were going out to lunch. A drug company markets birth control without adequate medical testing. If a woman that uses that birth control develops an illness as a result of the use of that birth control, then it could be said that that drug company was not acting with a reasonable amount of care because they did not properly test this product before they had sold it on the market. So just like in Law 1, when you learn about crimes and how each crime is defined by certain elements, each of which have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in court in order for a defendant to be found guilty of that crime, torts operate the same way. You have elements of negligence. There are 4 elements of negligence. So, and I'm going to elaborate on those in just a moment, but unlike intentional torts, many of which have very specific names, like battery, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, slander, libel. Negligence is just kind of this broad umbrella term. And the reason why it's very, very broad is because you can't come up with a name for every single type of accident that could possibly occur. There is an infinite amount of ways that people can fail to use reasonable care in their everyday life. There's an infinite amount of ways that people can be injured as a result of somebody else's failure to use reasonable care. So the term negligence is just kind of this broad umbrella term that describes when somebody fails to use that reasonable care and somebody else is harmed as a result. So for a plaintiff to win a negligence lawsuit, each of the following four elements must be proven by a preponderance of the evidence. Remember, in Law 1, when we were talking about criminal law, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. The equivalent of like 99.9% of the evidence must show that that defendant definitely committed that crime. But the standard in civil law, lawsuits, is much lower. The standard in civil law is just the preponderance, which is a fancy word for majority. The majority of the evidence needs to be on the plaintiff's side. So the equivalent of 51%. All right, so the elements of negligence. Let's walk through all four of them. Number one is duty. The defendant owed a duty or a responsibility, an obligation of care to the plaintiff, being the injured person. So did the defendant have some sort of responsibility to be careful in what they were doing? Number two, breach of duty. To breach something means to violate it. So if you are violating that duty, you have violated that responsibility. That number one, society expected that you used a reasonable amount of care when, I don't know, driving your car. But if you were texting while driving, you would have breached or violated that duty. That society expects you to use a reasonable amount of care when behind the wheel, but if you're texting while driving, you're not doing that. Number three, causation. So did the defendant's conduct cause the plaintiff's harm? And then number four, damages. Damages, meaning that the plaintiff must have suffered actual damage, and be an injury or financial loss as a result of the plaintiff's or as a result of the defendant's actions. All right, so let's put this into practice. Maybe it'll make a little more sense if I give you a scenario here. So let's take that birth control example from the second slide. If the very first question that would need to be addressed in court is, did the drug company have a duty of care to its customers to adequately test birth control before selling it? In this case, the answer would probably be yes. That I can't imagine a scenario in which a drug company creates this new medical product and then doesn't do any adequate testing and just decides to go out there, sell it on the market, and cross your fingers, hope for the best. No, the Food and Drug Administration is going to make sure that any medical products that are placed out there on the market have been adequately tested and are safe. So in this case, the drug company would probably, almost certainly, have a duty of care to its customers. Then the second element, did the company breach this duty by failing to adequately test the device? Once again, the answer is probably. That's if you are putting products out there that have not been adequately tested, there's a good chance that you violated that responsibility to exercise a reasonable amount of care. Number 3, did this breach of duty result in a defective product that caused, the third element, actual damage, the fourth element? This gets tricky. So let's assume that a woman develops very bad stomach pains 2 weeks after she started using this birth control device. In court, that plaintiff would have to definitively prove that that device was the cause of her stomach pains. And sometimes that can be hard to pinpoint, to say that I'm having stomach pains because of this device. And it can't be any other possible reason. It was definitely this device. The fourth element is, what were the damages? Was there physical injury here? Next, the reasonable person standard. This might have been confusing to you as you read it. So, to help judges determine whether conduct is negligence, the law has developed an imaginary creature. So, the imaginary creature's name is the reasonable person of ordinary prudence or carefulness. So prudence would kind of be like wisdom, intelligence. So this does not represent the typical average person, because the typical average person may not use as much care as is expected of them in society. Rather, this is kind of like the idealized version of such a person. So would the ideal person have acted this way, or did the defendant in question act below the standard that we hold them to? So if you look right here, you have this gauge. We're over all the way to the right. These would be best practices. That's if you are a doctor and you are using best practices, you are up to date with the medical research and all of the proper procedures that are required when performing some sort of medical procedure. Then you have better. Better's still really good. It's better than good enough. You are still doing a really good job. Good enough is, all right, you're using enough care when performing some sort of action, but you're beginning to push it. You're coming scary close to negligent. Negligent, here's the bar. That anything below this bar of negligence suggests that this person was not using the proper amount of care when performing some sort of action. And then you get gross negligence. Gross negligence is this idea of reckless behavior. That it wasn't just you failed to use a reasonable amount of care. It was no, you were being stupid in how careless you were. That no reasonable person would have ever acted that way. And then you have intent. Intent, we already talked about intentional torts, that you meant to do it. This was no accident. This was not recklessness. This was behavior that was intentional. All right, so how does a reasonable person behave? A reasonable person in society generally considers how likely a certain harm is to occur, how serious the harm would be if it did occur, and then third, the burden involved in avoiding the harm. So the example that was given to you by your textbook is just somebody that was walking across the street. Walking across the street can be a dangerous activity, but if you're walking across, I don't know, let's say Maroon Drive. You're walking across Maroon Drive. Maroon Drive is the street right in front of Elgin High School. And you're walking right in front of Maroon Drive at 7 o'clock p.m. There's not too many cars driving down Maroon Drive. So if you're walking across Maroon Drive, the calculations that go through your head before you walk across the street is, how likely am I going to get hit by a car? The answer to that question is probably not too likely. you move to the next calculation in your head. If I did get hit by a car, how serious would that harm be? Probably pretty serious. Even though the car is driving down Maroon Drive or probably not going any faster than about 30 miles an hour, you're still getting hit by a car. So the harm would be pretty serious. And then third, the burden involved in avoiding the harm. So how burdensome is it going to be to avoid getting hit by a car? 7 o'clock, Maroon Drive, probably not all that burdensome. You look left, you look right, you cross the street. So that's how a reasonable person would behave. Those are the calculations that would go through my head when crossing the street, your head when crossing the street. So let's move on and talk about negligence and property. So law requires you to use reasonable care to protect others from harm when they're on your property. It should be noted that this does not apply to trespassers. If somebody trespasses onto your property and gets hurt as a result of the trespass, you don't have to pay them any money. They weren't supposed to be on your property to begin with. So if you had, I think the example in your book was if you had a sprinkler out on your lawn and you had somebody was walking across your lawn, tripped, fell over the sprinkler, and ends up breaking their fall with their hands and end up snapping their wrist. They broke their wrist and they try to sue you because it was your sprinkler, it happened on your property, you should be responsible for it, and the law is going to be on your side. That generally speaking, trespassers cannot recover damages because they weren't supposed to be on your property to begin with. There is an exception to this rule though, and the exception to the rule is the attractive nuisance doctrine. So the attractive nuisance doctrine is if a person keeps something on their property that is likely to attract children, that person must take reasonable steps. I forgot a word there. It should be steps. Steps against the dangers that the conditions might cause. So let me give you an example. There was, I don't know, some of you might remember this, but it was last year. It's no longer there, but on Maroon Drive, there, right across the street from Elgin High School, I should say not right down the street, but on Maroon Drive, a little further down, there was a house that had a trampoline in the front yard. Not the backyard, but in the front yard there was a trampoline. That's an attractive nuisance. That if after school one day you have 3 kids decide to sneak onto this person's property, start jumping on the trampoline, one kid ends up falling awkwardly, breaking their leg, they can sue that property owner for damages because that property owner should not have a trampoline in their front yard. That's an attractive nuisance. It's something that is likely to attract children. Another example, my parents have an in-ground pool back in my childhood home. And this in-ground pool is fenced in. It's fenced in because of this attractive nuisance doctrine. We need to make sure that no kids from the area are sneaking in onto our property and then using that pool, and let's say, God forbid, somebody drowns as a result of using the pool. The attractive nuisance doctrine doesn't mean that you have to build a fortress around that nuisance. Rather, all you have to do is take reasonable precautions to ensure that children cannot access that nuisance, that hazard. All right, negligence in businesses. The law imposes a higher duty, higher responsibility on businesses and other public establishments. So it's not enough to just say, yes, they have a responsibility to make sure that people are aware that the sidewalks out front of their business is icy. You can't just put a sign up and say caution, sidewalks are icy. No, if you run a public establishment, then you have to take extra precautions to make sure that your business is safe. So you can't just put up that sign. You actually have to go out and shovel and salt. And this is the same reason why Elgin High School, on snowy, icy days, you have people from maintenance are outside really early in the morning, sprinkling salt in front of all the entrances and shoveling the sidewalks, and because we need to make sure that this public school is safe for all the students and that nobody gets hurt. Negligence in professionals. So certain professionals are considered to have abilities of reasonably skilled members of their profession. So take doctors, plumbers, pilots. If you have a plumber that was fixing a sink, and let's say that this plumber did not do their job properly, ended up leaving, and then the whole kitchen flooded, causes thousands of dollars of damages. That plumber can't say, well, I used as much care as a reasonably prudent, careful person would. Well, a reasonably prudent, wise, and careful person doesn't know how to plumb. They don't know plumbing. So the standard that this plumber would be held to, in contrast, is, did they behave? Did they use a reasonable amount of care for a prudent, careful plumber? Same thing with doctors. You can't have just a surgeon screws up a surgery and says, well, the average person would have probably done this. This was a reasonable mistake for an average person. And no, the standard of care is a little higher. The question is not, would the average person have screwed up this surgery? The question is, would a reasonably intelligent and careful surgeon have made the same mistake? Negligence in minors. So minors are responsible for the torts that they commit. The standard of care, however, is lower than that of adults. Now, in general, a minor's standard of care is usually compared to a reasonably intelligent minor of the same age and experience of that defendant. But the one exception is when minors engage in adult activities like driving. They're going to be held to an adult standard of care. So if you are 17 years old and you still have your learner's permit at that age, and you're driving around and you've got a Coke in one hand, you got 1, 2, 3, 4 people in the car, you're blaring your music, maybe you're texting while driving, a reasonable adult would not have acted that way. And so you can't use a defense in court that, well, hey, a reasonable person my age would have probably done this. And no, because you are performing an adult activity, your behavior is going to be compared to a reasonably prudent and careful adult. So let's talk about causation and damages really quick. So causation. Causation can be tricky because you have really two separate issues here. One is cause and fact, and two is proximate cause. Cause and fact is really easy for you to wrap your head around. Would the plaintiff's injuries have occurred if not for the defendant's actions? So the example that the book gave you, I think it's a really good example of illustrating the difference between these two, is the Chicago fire. Great Chicago fire happens 1871, and the story goes, you have a woman by the name of Mrs. O'Leary. She puts a lantern next to a cow's hind leg in her barn. The cow ends up kicking the lantern over, lights the barn on fire, and because of the powerful wind that day, the wind ends up blowing the fire onto the house next door, which ends up blowing the fire onto the house next door to that, and then so on and so forth. And then soon, most of the city of Chicago is on fire. Well, who has to pay for that? Who's liable for all of that damage? If you're looking at cause in fact, it's Mrs. O'Leary. That who caused all of this fire? Well, yeah, if Mrs. O'Leary actually did put that lantern next to that cow's leg, then the city of Chicago would not have burned down to the ground had it not been for her actions. But what the law is concerned with is not cause and fact. The law is generally concerned with proximate cause. Proximate cause is the determination of whether there was a close connection between the wrongful act and the harm that was caused. So, would it be reasonable for Miss O'Leary to have foreseen her house and maybe a neighbor's house or two lighting on fire as a result of her negligent behavior? Yeah, that would have been a foreseeable amount of damage. But would anybody have possibly foreseen practically the entire city burning down to the ground because she laid a lantern next to a cow's leg? No. That there's not proximate causation there. There's not a close connection between those two. Another example I can give you is let's say that you are moving into you're moving into a new apartment, and you're bringing one of those long door mirrors with you, and let's say it's a really sunny day and the sun ends up coming down and then bouncing off that mirror, and then it shines way 13 floors above, ends up blinding a window washer that is wiping down some windows. And this window washer is temporarily blinded by the sun and ends up kicking over a bucket of water and soap, and this bucket of water and soap falls all the way to the ground 13 floors below, where you have Amy, a jogger, is running, ends up slipping, falling on this soap and water, hitting her head, and then going to the hospital. Did your action of moving in that mirror in fact cause Amy's injury? Yeah, she would not have gotten hurt had you not been moving that mirror in on that day and angling it the way that you did. But would there have been proximate cause? The answer is no. That there's no way anybody would have reasonably foreseen Amy's injuries occurring because you moved a mirror in to a new apartment. The last topic is damages. Damages, the theory behind damages is that the plaintiff should be restored to his or her pre-injury condition to the extent that can be achieved with money. So, in order for a plaintiff to successfully sue, they have to be able to demonstrate by a preponderance of the evidence that they have suffered damages related to hospital bills, lost wages, maybe they couldn't go back to work because of the injuries that they had sustained, damage to property, reduced future earnings. Reduced future earnings is an interesting one. It's if somebody ends up, let's say a professional athlete ends up being injured as a result of somebody's negligent driving. Well, that professional athlete, let's say, loses a hand as a result of this. that professional athlete is going to have reduced future earnings. Maybe they were going to sign a multi-million-dollar contract, and suddenly nobody wants to sign this football player anymore because that football player only has one hand now. That would be reduced future earnings. Pain and suffering. This one is a hard one. Pain and suffering and emotional distress are hard to demonstrate in court, but sometimes you do have people successfully sue for pain and suffering and also emotional distress. All right, that's all I have for you today. I hope I was able to clarify some of the concepts that you learned about last Thursday. If any of you have any questions for me, just reach out. I'd be more than happy to help. All right, miss you guys.